Welcome back to Wild HOA Situations. The old scam came back because it worked once. The folder hit the table so hard the metal key fob bounced twice. "Do not call your friend. Call the office," Evelyn said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I stood there in the cramped back office of the Boundary Oaks HOA Incorporated Management Building, my work shirt still damp from the drizzle outside, and watched her tap that key fob again like she was calling a meeting to order. She held up a laminated policy sheet between us like a shield. "The evidence list was sealed," she said, and that was final. "I work as a court runner. I file documents and know deadlines. I know what sealed means, and I know what it does not mean. This was not sealed. This was hidden. 5 years ago, someone filed a gate access violation against me, backdated a notice, and buried the whole thing in a folder that vanished the day I asked to see it. The fine never stuck back then because I proved I was out of state that week, but the paperwork stayed in my file like a ghost. 2 weeks ago, it resurfaced. A new notice arrived at my door with the same violation code, the same date stamp, and a brand new escalating fine schedule that reset every time I tried to comply. The letter said I owed $400 and counting, and if I did not pay within 72 hours, they would tow my vehicle and place a lien on my property. I am paying for a family medical expense right now. Every bogus fee hurts. I cannot afford to let this slide. So I reopened the case. I started gathering proof. I built a clean timeline packet with dates, receipts, and photos. I clipped everything together and carried it everywhere. I also carried the flashlight clip to my pocket because I learned a long time ago that deadlines happen after dark, and you need to see what you are signing. Evelyn Lee is the gate access administrator for Boundary Oaks. She has shoulder-length, straight gray hair with a side part, and she wears a white windbreaker and a white bucket hat everywhere she goes, even indoors. She abuses codes. She has a catchphrase: "If you want mercy, move somewhere without an HOA." She said it to me the first time we met, and she has said it at least twice since. Today she said it again, right after she told me the evidence list was sealed. She tapped that key fob on the table one more time and leaned back in her chair like she had just won a chess match. I did not move. I just looked at her and said, "I filed a records request 3 days ago. You have 5 business days to respond under state law." She blinked. Her face went blank for half a second. Then she smiled. "I do not need proof," she said. "I have paperwork and vibes." That line should have been funny. It was not. It was a tell. She was admitting she had nothing solid, and she was daring me to prove it. I made a note of the time and the exact words. I knew I would need them later. I did not play my hand yet, and she thought that meant I had none. The meeting ended when she stood up and told me to leave. I walked out into the drizzle and checked my phone. I had 61 hours left before the tow deadline. The tow yard closes at 6, and if they take my vehicle, I cannot recover it until tomorrow, which means I lose a day of work and rack up storage fees I cannot afford. I needed to move fast. I called my neighbor Marcus. He is calm, patient, and tired of Evelyn. He agreed to be a witness. He also agreed to dig through his own correspondence with the HOA because he remembered getting a similar violation notice 2 years ago that never made sense. He said he would meet me at the mailbox cluster in an hour. I drove home and pulled every document I had: the original 2020 violation notice, the proof I was out of state, the refund confirmation, the new 2025 notice with the same violation code and a different fine amount. I laid them all out on my kitchen counter and took photos with timestamps visible. Then I noticed something. The signature block on the 2020 notice was blank. The signature block on the 2025 notice had a stamp, but the stamp said 2020. Someone had backdated it. Someone had pulled an old blank form, filled it in, and tried to pass it off as proof of an ongoing violation. That someone was Evelyn. I clipped the photos together and added them to my timeline packet. Then I checked the HOA portal. I logged in and pulled the audit log. Every action in the system is supposed to be tracked. I scrolled back to 2020 and found my original case. The case was opened in March 2020. It was closed in April 2020 with a refund issued, but in January 2025 someone reopened it. The username on the log entry was Lee. The timestamp was 2 weeks ago, the same day the new notice arrived. I took a screenshot and added it to my packet. I met Marcus at the mailbox cluster. The drizzle had picked up, so we stood under the eave of the little mail shelter. He handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a violation notice from 2023. Same code. Same format. Same blank signature block. He said he paid it because he did not want the hassle, but he always wondered why the notice came 6 months after the alleged violation. I looked at the envelope. The postmark was August 2023. The violation date was February 2023. I held it up next to mine. Identical template. Same wording. Same stamp placement. Different dates. That is when Evelyn showed up. She was carrying a clipboard and moving orange cones around the mailbox cluster like she was setting up a construction zone. She saw us and stopped. "What are you two doing?" she said. Marcus said, "Checking our mail." She said, "No, you are loitering. This is a violation of the pedestrian traffic policy." I looked at her. I said, "There is no pedestrian traffic policy." She tapped her clipboard. "Yes, there is. I just printed it." She handed me a single sheet of paper. It had today's date at the top. It was a policy she had written that morning. I read the first line out loud. "Loitering near mailbox clusters is prohibited during peak hours." I looked at her. "What are peak hours?" She said, "Whatever hours I say." Marcus started laughing. Evelyn did not like that. She pulled out her phone and called someone. She said, "I need a compliance check at the mailbox cluster." Then she hung up and stared at us like she had just summoned backup. A board member arrived 10 minutes later. His name was Greg. He looked tired. He looked at the cones, looked at Evelyn and said, "What is this about?" Evelyn said, "These two are violating the pedestrian traffic policy." Greg said, "What pedestrian traffic policy?" Evelyn held up her clipboard. Greg read it and sighed. He said, "Evelyn, you cannot make up policies on the spot." She said, "I am the gate access administrator. I have authority over access zones." Greg said, "The mailbox cluster is not an access zone." Evelyn said, "It is if I say it is." Greg turned to me. He said, "Look, I know your file is thick. I know this has been going on for a while. Maybe you should just pay the fine and move on. It would be easier for everyone." I said, "No." He said, "I am trying to help you." I said, "Then help me by enforcing the rules evenly." He did not answer. He just walked back to his car and left. Evelyn smiled. She said, "If you want mercy, move somewhere without an HOA." I held up the timeline packet. I said, "I have proof you backdated this notice. I have proof you reopened a closed case. I have proof you are targeting me with fake violations." She looked at the packet and laughed. She said, "That is not evidence. That is a scrapbook." Then she turned and walked away, moving her cones as she went. If you are enjoying this, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss the next upload. Marcus looked at me. He said, "She is insane." I said, "She is systematic. This is not random. This is a pattern." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to find the rest of the pattern." He said, "How?" I said, "I am going to talk to everyone she has ever violated." I spent the next 2 days knocking on doors. I talked to 12 homeowners. 8 of them had received violation notices from Evelyn in the past 3 years. 5 of them paid. 3 of them fought and lost. Every single notice had the same format. Every single notice had a blank signature block or a backdated stamp. Every single notice came months after the alleged violation. I collected copies. I built a spreadsheet. I tracked the dates, the codes, and the outcomes. The pattern was clear. Evelyn was pulling old blank forms, filling them in with new dates, and sending them out as fresh violations. She was generating fines to justify her rule. I also found out that the HOA management company had conducted an internal audit 6 months ago. The audit was supposed to review vendor contracts and compliance workflows. The results were never published. I filed a second records request asking for the audit report. The HOA had 5 business days to respond. I waited. On day 4, I got a letter. The letter was from an attorney. It was full of bluff language meant to scare me into paying instantly. It said I was harassing board members. It said I was disrupting HOA operations. It said if I did not pay the outstanding fine and drop my records requests, the HOA would pursue legal action for defamation and interference. The letter had no case number. It had no filing receipt. It was a scare tactic. I called the attorney's office. The receptionist said the attorney was not available. I said, "That is fine. I just want to confirm you sent this letter." She said, "Hold on." She came back a minute later and said, "That letter was sent at the request of the HOA board." I said, "Who signed the request?" She said, "I cannot disclose that." I said, "Okay. Thank you." I hung up and added the letter to my packet. The next day, I got a response to my records request. The response was a single sentence. The audit report is exempt from disclosure under attorney-client privilege. That was a lie. The audit was conducted by a third-party vendor, not an attorney. I called the management company and asked to speak to the compliance officer. They transferred me 3 times. Finally, someone picked up and said, "This is Evelyn." I almost laughed. She was the compliance officer. She was investigating herself. I said, "I want a copy of the vendor audit report from 6 months ago." She said, "That report is privileged." I said, "No, it is not." She said, "I do not need to explain HOA policy to you." I said, "This is not HOA policy. This is state law." She said, "If you keep harassing the board, I will have you removed from the property." I said, "You cannot remove me from my own property." She said, "Watch me." Then she hung up. I had 48 hours left before the tow deadline. I needed to escalate. I called the management company again and asked to speak to the regional manager. They said the regional manager would call me back within 24 hours. I said, "I need to speak to someone now." They said, "I am sorry, that is our policy." I hung up and drove to the management office. I walked in and asked to see the compliance officer. The receptionist said, "Do you have an appointment?" I said, "No." She said, "Then you need to make an appointment." I said, "I am here to file a formal complaint." She said, You can do that online. I said I tried. The portal does not work. She sighed and handed me a form. I filled it out and handed it back. She said, "Someone will contact you within 10 business days." I said, "I do not have 10 business days." She said, "I am sorry." I walked out and sat in my car. I checked my phone. I had a voicemail. It was from Marcus. He said, "I found something. Call me back." I called him. He said, "I was going through my old emails and I found a message from the HOA vendor the month before the audit. The vendor sent a draft invoice for the audit. The invoice listed 3 areas of review: gate access compliance, vendor contract oversight, records retention. Guess who was listed as the point of contact for gate access compliance?" I said, "Evelyn." He said, "Evelyn." I asked Marcus to forward me the email. He did. I opened it and read the invoice. The description was blank. The cost was $12,000. The payment status was pending. The invoice was dated 6 months ago. The audit was supposed to be completed within 30 days, but the audit report was never published, and the invoice was still listed as pending. I called the vendor. I asked to speak to the auditor who conducted the review. The receptionist said, "That information is confidential." I said, "I am a homeowner in the association. I have a right to know if the audit was completed." She said, "Hold on." She came back and said, "The audit was completed and submitted to the board in October. If you want a copy, you need to contact the board." I said, "Thank you." I hung up and added the invoice to my packet. The audit was completed. The board had it. The board was refusing to release it. That meant the audit found something. I filed a 3rd records request, this time specifically asking for the vendor audit report submitted in October. I also sent a copy of the request to the regional manager and copied the state HOA ombudsman. I was done playing nice. I was done waiting for callbacks. I was building a case, and I was going to force them to respond. That night, I got a knock on my door. It was a tow truck driver. He said, "I am here to tow your vehicle." I said, "On whose authority?" He said, "HOA violation." I said, "Show me the work order." He handed me a printed sheet. It had my address, my vehicle description, and a violation code. It also had Evelyn's signature at the bottom. I said, "This violation was disputed." He said, "I just do what the work order says." I said, "If you tow this vehicle, I will file a complaint with the police and the towing commission." He looked at me. He looked at the work order. He said, "I am going to call my dispatcher." He walked back to his truck and made the call. He came back and said, "My dispatcher says to wait until they confirm with the HOA." I said, "Good." He sat in his truck and waited. I called the police non-emergency line. I explained the situation. The dispatcher said, "This sounds like a civil matter." I said, "This is harassment." The dispatcher said, "If the tow company has a valid work order, we cannot stop them." I said, "The work order is based on a fraudulent violation." The dispatcher said, "You will need to prove that in court." I said, "I am trying to." The dispatcher said, "I will send an officer to document the situation." I said, "Thank you." A deputy arrived 20 minutes later. I handed him my timeline packet. I showed him the original 2020 notice, the refund confirmation, the new 2025 notice with the backdated stamp, the audit log screenshot, the vendor invoice, and the attorney scare letter. I walked him through the whole thing. I said, "This woman is targeting me with fake violations. She reopened a closed case, backdated a notice, and now she is trying to tow my vehicle to force me to pay a fine I do not owe." The deputy read everything. He looked at the tow driver. He said, "Do you have confirmation from the HOA that this is a valid tow?" The tow driver said, "My dispatcher is still trying to reach them." The deputy said, "Then I suggest you wait." The tow driver nodded. The deputy turned to me. He said, "I am going to note the harassment language in my report. If this escalates, you need to file for a restraining order." I said, "I am working on it." He said, "Good." He walked over to the tow truck and talked to the driver for a few minutes. Then he came back and said, "The driver is leaving. If they come back without proper authorization, call us immediately." I said, "Thank you." The deputy left. The tow driver left. I stood in my driveway and checked my phone. I had 36 hours left before the tow deadline officially expired, but the threat was still active. Evelyn was not going to stop. The next morning, I got an email from the regional manager. The email said the board had reviewed my records requests and determined that the audit report contained proprietary vendor information and could not be released. The email also said that my complaint against Evelyn had been forwarded to the board for review and that I would receive a response within 30 days. The email ended with a reminder that continued harassment of board members could result in fines and legal action. I forwarded the email to the state HOA ombudsman with a cover letter explaining the situation. I also filed a complaint with the State Real Estate Commission, which oversees HOA management companies. I was building a paper trail. I was making sure that every refusal, every delay, and every threat was documented. I was also running out of time. I called Marcus. I said, "I need your help." He said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need you to come to the next board meeting with me." He said, "When is it?" I said, "Tomorrow night." He said, "I will be there." That afternoon, I got a call from Greg, the board member who told me to just pay the fine. He said, "I need to talk to you off the record." I said, "Okay." He said, "Evelyn is wrong. I know she is wrong, but I cannot say it on the record because the board president is backing her." I said, "Why is the board president backing her?" He said, "Because Evelyn handles all the gate access complaints, and if we admit she made a mistake, we open the door to a dozen other disputes." I said, "So you are protecting her to avoid liability?" He said, "I am protecting the HOA." I said, "You are protecting corruption." He did not respond. He just said, "I am sorry," and hung up. I added the call to my notes. I had the pattern. I had the proof. I had witnesses. I just needed one more thing. I needed the trump card. And I had it. 3 days ago, Marcus sent me a video. He did not tell me about it until now because he was not sure it was relevant. But it was. The video was from a dog walker who was filming her dog near the mailbox cluster the day Evelyn moved the cones and accused us of loitering. The video was 30 seconds long. It showed Evelyn placing a violation notice on my mailbox before we arrived. The timestamp on the video was 10 minutes before we got there. She had planted the notice, then showed up with her clipboard and accused us of violating a policy she had invented that morning. It was premeditated. It was entrapment. It was the smoking gun. I did not tell anyone about the video. I kept it in my pocket. I waited. I knew the moment would come when Evelyn would repeat her claim one last time, on the record, in front of witnesses, and that would be the moment I played it. The board meeting was held in the community center conference room. 23 homeowners showed up. Marcus sat next to me. Evelyn sat at the front table with the board president and 2 other board members. Greg was not there. The board president opened the meeting and ran through the agenda. When we got to homeowner comments, I raised my hand. The board president said, "Yes." I stood up and said, "I am here to address a pattern of fraudulent violations issued by the gate access administrator." Evelyn stood up immediately. She said, "That is a lie." The board president said, "Let him finish." I said, "I have documentation showing that multiple homeowners received backdated violation notices over the past 3 years. I have proof that the gate access administrator reopened a closed case, forged a signature stamp, and attempted to tow my vehicle based on a fake fine. I have a vendor invoice showing that an internal audit was completed 6 months ago and never published. I have emails, portal logs, and witness statements." I held up my timeline packet. I said, "This is all documented. I am requesting that the board release the audit report and remove the gate access administrator from her position immediately." The room went silent. Evelyn stood up and slammed her hand on the table. She said, "This is harassment. This is defamation. This man has been stalking me for weeks. He is trying to destroy my reputation because he does not want to pay a legitimate fine." She looked around the room. She said, "I do not need proof. I have paperwork and vibes." There it was. The boomerang line. She said it again in front of 23 witnesses, on the record. I smiled. I said, "You just admitted you have no proof." Evelyn said, "I have the violation notice." I said, "The notice you backdated." She said, "I did not backdate anything." I said, "Then explain why the signature stamp says 2020 but the notice was sent in 2025. She said, "That is a clerical error." I said, "Explain why the portal audit log shows you reopened a closed case 2 weeks before the notice was sent." She said, "That is normal procedure." I said, "Explain why 8 other homeowners received identical notices with the same backdated stamp." She did not answer. She just stared at me. The board president said, "Do you have proof of these claims?" I said, "Yes." I walked up to the front table and handed him my timeline packet. He opened it and started reading. His face went pale. He looked at Evelyn. He said, "Is this true?" She said, "No." He said, "It says here, you reopened a closed case." She said, "I was correcting an error." He said, "It says here the case was closed with a refund issued." She said, "The refund was issued in error." He said, "Then why did you not reopen it in 2020? Why did you wait 5 years?" She did not answer. The board president looked at the other board members. He said, "We need to review this." Evelyn said, "There is nothing to review. This is a witch hunt." The board president said, "Sit down, Evelyn." She did not sit down. She said, "If you want mercy, move somewhere without an HOA." I said, "I have one more thing." I pulled out my phone. I said, 3 days ago, a dog walker filmed you placing a violation notice on my mailbox 10 minutes before you showed up at the mailbox cluster and accused me of loitering. You planted the evidence. You staged the violation. You tried to frame me. I played the video. The room erupted. Homeowners started shouting. Evelyn said, "That video is fake." I said, "It has a timestamp. It has metadata. It shows your face, your clipboard, and your orange cones. It shows you committing fraud." The board president stood up. He said, This meeting is over. We will reconvene in executive session to review this evidence." Evelyn said, "You cannot do this." The board president said, "Sit down, Evelyn." She did not sit down. She grabbed her key fob and walked out. The door slammed behind her. The board president looked at me. He said, "We will contact you within 48 hours. I said, "Thank you." I walked out with Marcus. He said, "That was incredible." I said, "It is not over yet." 2 days later, I got a call from the board president. He said, "We reviewed your evidence. We also reviewed the vendor audit report. The audit found multiple procedural violations in the gate access compliance workflow. Evelyn was issuing notices without board approval. She was backdating documents. She was pocketing processing fees. The board voted unanimously to remove her from the gate access administrator position effective immediately. We are also banning her from contacting homeowners outside official meetings. We will issue a formal apology and refund all fines associated with the fraudulent violations." I said, "What about the other homeowners?" He said, "We are contacting everyone who received a similar notice and offering full refunds." I said, "What about the attorney letter?" He said that letter was sent without board approval. We are terminating our relationship with that attorney. I said, "What about my filing fees?" He said the HOA will pay your filing fees to end the fight. I said, "Good." He said, "I am sorry this happened." I said, "I am not the one you need to apologize to." He said, "I know." He hung up. 3 days later, the HOA held an emergency board meeting. The board voted to censure Evelyn in public, strip her committee powers, and ban her from contacting homeowners outside official meetings. The vote was unanimous. Evelyn did not attend. The board also announced that the management company had conducted a follow-up audit and found additional procedural violations. The audit triggered a full management review, and the board hired a new compliance officer. The new officer published the vendor audit report on the HOA website the next day. I downloaded the report and read it. The audit found that Evelyn had issued over 40 backdated notices in 3 years. She had collected over $18,000 in processing fees that were never deposited into the HOA account. She had also deleted portal records to cover her tracks. The report recommended immediate termination and a referral to law enforcement. The board forwarded the report to the district attorney. I do not know if charges were filed, but I know Evelyn is no longer involved with the HOA. A week after the meeting, I ran into Marcus at the mailbox cluster. He said, "Did you hear?" I said, "Hear what?" He said, "Evelyn tried to run for the board in the next election. She got 3 votes. I said 3. He said her husband, and 1 person who voted for the wrong name by accident. I laughed. He said, "The new compliance officer is great. She published the meeting minutes online. She set up a complaint hotline. She is actually doing the job." I said, "Good." He said, "You did that." I said, "We did that." The funny karma moment came 2 months later. Evelyn sent a letter to the HOA demanding a refund for her annual dues. She said she was being unfairly targeted by the new compliance officer. The new compliance officer reviewed the letter and sent a response. The response said, "Processing fee for records request, $25. Payment due within 10 business days." Evelyn paid it. The irony was not lost on anyone. The HOA also received a letter from the insurance company. The letter said the HOA needed to stop selective enforcement immediately or risk losing coverage. The insurance company had reviewed the audit report and determined that the HOA was exposing itself to liability. The letter was copied to every board member. It was also posted on the HOA website. The letter ended with a single sentence. It is about safety, and the insurer email says stop. I framed that sentence and hung it in my office. It is a reminder that systems only work when people enforce the rules evenly. Boundary Oaks is a place where everything requires a form and the form requires another form, but now the forms are real, the rules are public, and the people in charge are accountable. I kept my timeline packet. I also kept the video. I made copies and stored them in 3 places. I learned a long time ago that evidence disappears when people want it to disappear, so you protect it, you back it up. You make it impossible to erase. The cold case is closed. The culprit is caught. The pattern is exposed. A management audit exposed the full scope of Evelyn's scheme, and the HOA is paying my filing fees to end the fight. Karen lost her committee role immediately. The payback was lawful, systematic, and permanent. The neighborhood is quieter now. The rules are clearer. The people in charge answer questions instead of hiding behind policies they invented that morning. I still live in Fargo, North Dakota. I still work as a court runner. I still carry my flashlight clipped to my pocket because deadlines happen after dark and you need to see what you are signing. I still check my mail at the cluster, and I still run into Marcus. We do not talk about Evelyn much anymore. We do not need to. The story is over. The evidence spoke. The system worked. And the next time someone tries to pull a scam in Boundary Oaks, they will think twice, because they know someone is watching, someone is documenting, and someone will reopen the case. The HOA sent me a formal apology letter 3 weeks after the board vote. The letter was signed by the board president and the new compliance officer. It acknowledged the procedural violations. It confirmed the refund. It thanked me for bringing the issue to their attention. I filed the letter with the rest of my documentation. I did not frame it. I did not celebrate it. I just added it to the stack and moved on. The tow yard never came back. The attorney never followed up. The fines were erased. The case was closed. The neighborhood moved forward. And I learned that the best revenge is not vandalism or fraud or violence. The best revenge is patience, documentation, and the willingness to stand in the rain with a timeline packet and a flashlight, waiting for the moment when the person who abused the system finally abuses it one time too many, on the record, in front of witnesses, and the whole thing collapses under the weight of their own rules. I will see you in the next upload.